페르소나!
Persona Q2 is almost certainly the last major 3DS release, or at the very least it is the final 3DS game that I'll be playing. My 3DS hasn't really been used for over a year already, so charging it up to play Persona Q2 was like its official retirement party, and it was one hell of a party. There really isn't any better way to send off the 3DS. Persona Q2 has so much style, and it uses the very limited resources of the console so well you sometimes forget that it's a 3DS game. The amount of voice work alone sets it apart from most of the 3DS's catalogue. Unfortunately, that voice work isn't localized, but it's easy to see why. Redubbing that much voice work for a very late release on the 3DS, which is for all intents and purposes a near-death platform in the West, wouldn't have made much sense economically. The other thing that surprised me was the use of so many different methods of story delivery. There are beautifully animated cutscenes and in-engine cutscenes, visual novel-like sequences, and just straight up text box conversations in the middle of dungeons. It highlights just about every little thing the 3DS is capable of. It's a journey through all the great games and genres the 3DS has been home of for the past 7 or 8 years. Well, it shows off almost everything the 3DS is capable of anyway, but as it stands you'd be forgiven for forgetting what the 3D and 3DS is meant to stand for, since we haven't really had any games utilize the 3D function in any meaningful way for at least a few years now. Persona Q2 likewise doesn't use the 3D aspect of the 3DS. I suspect the hardware resources were used elsewhere. It's at this point I should mention that my gameplay here is captured through a 3DS running custom firmware and not a 3DS capture card, so the frame rate of what you see in my gameplay isn't indicative of the actual frame rate. Capturing footage wirelessly as I have caps at around 35 to 40 FPS and fluctuates pretty wildly. The performance in-game is actually pretty impressive given how good the game looks most of the time. There was definitely a whole lot of development trickery involved putting this game together. I dug through the game files with a large amount of difficulty originally to find the source files for the animated cutscenes, which I did eventually find, for the most part. Even though some of the in-game cutscenes were built in the same way as the animated cutscenes were, most of them weren't, and I still have absolutely no idea how they implemented the subtitles for cutscenes or where they are even hidden among the files. Something I did figure out though was that assets for things like the all-out attacks are a ton of individual pieces. This allows those sequences to be put together dynamically and perfectly accurate to the status of the party. If one of the characters is dead or stunned, they aren't included in the all-out attack, and the exceedingly stylish sequences reflect that. It just occurred to me that I haven't really even talked about what Persona Q2 is. So for those of you out of the loop, Persona Q2, just like its predecessor, is a dungeon crawler spin-off of the Persona series. The dungeon crawling mechanics are in the same vein as Etrian Odyssey, but it differs from Etrian Odyssey in quite a few ways. The biggest difference though is in story. My friend who loves Etrian Odyssey has a great description for the series, and that is that it's like playing a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. You're the one doing most of the story making. It's very bare bones in that department. Persona Q2 on the other hand is extremely story heavy. Everything from the overall narrative of being trapped inside a mysterious cinema to the inconsequential character interaction dialogue is placed front and center. It's undoubtedly the most important thing in the game, and could honestly pass as its own visual novel if they removed everything else. Thankfully they didn't remove everything else though, because the gameplay that takes a backseat to storytelling is also more than good enough to carry a game in its own right. And just quickly before moving on to gameplay, I do need to mention that the story in Persona Q2 is its own thing. It is most assuredly a spin-off and does not retcon anything from or affect the stories of Persona 3, 4, or 5. Now, the dungeon crawling mechanics are, as I said earlier, mostly like Etrian Odyssey. On the top screen you have a first person view, and on the bottom you have a map screen which starts as little more than a grid. You can move one space at a time in 4 directions, but it's up to you to fill in the map. As you move, the floor will be filled in for you automatically. You can also choose to have the walls filled in for you automatically as well, and honestly this is how I play because drawing the walls in manually is just tedious. Marking things like treasure points, chests, switches and doors is up to you though. None of it is actually necessary, but knowing exactly where shortcuts and treasure spots are is very useful as you'll be frequently jumping in and out of dungeons. Battles are both random encounters and turn-based, but the random encounter part isn't entirely random. There is a danger level on the screen which will count down to 1 as you take steps through the dungeon. Once it hits 1, an encounter is inevitable in the next few steps. The turn-based combat will feel very familiar to Atlas fans. You select an action for each member of your party, and then everything plays out between you and the enemies based on each character's speed. Enemies have weaknesses which will cause them to break, essentially stunning them and cancelling their turn if they haven't taken it already. Breaking all enemies on screen will give you the option to follow up with an all-out attack which deals massive damage to everything. Each character has a main persona which cannot be changed and grants them a set of baseline skills. Each character can also equip a sub-persona which basically gives you near limitless flexibility, and you do need that flexibility. There are something like 30 playable characters in the game, but you can only have 5 of them in your active party at any one time. You get sub-personas by killing rare monsters in dungeons, and the ever-popular fusion mechanic is also alive and well in Persona Q2. Heading to the Velvet Room will allow you to fuse personas into new ones, sacrifice them to level up others, or just pass on skills and re-summon previously used personas for currency. Characters gain stats from their main persona's level, their sub-persona, and also equipment. Weapons, armor, and accessories can be purchased from the shop, but they first need to be unlocked by selling various materials you collect from dungeons. Music is mostly reused or rearranged from the Persona series, which is certainly not a bad thing. There are plenty of familiar tracks and they are all toe-tappingly excellent. I really only have one complaint, and that's the silly restriction they put on how many sub-personas you can have at a time. You'll spend a large portion of the game only being able to have 10 and then 12, and that includes the ones you have equipped. Likewise, the item limit is a touch low as well, and I guess this was to encourage the frequent jumping in and out of dungeons. There are sometimes little events and interactions when you exit, but the small persona storage does get slightly annoying, especially in the third dungeon. Overall, Persona Q2 is among the best games on the 3DS. I honestly thought I was going to struggle to get through it, not because the game was bad, but because I had to play it on my 3DS. I loved my 3DS, but ever since I've had the Switch, it just doesn't feel good to play anymore. The biggest compliment I can give Persona Q2 is that it's so good, I actually forgot I was playing it on a 3DS. It doesn't feel held back by the hardware. It's infinitely stylish and addictive in so many ways. Persona fans will get a kick out of all the crazy crossover interactions, and the dungeon crawling gameplay will keep even non-Persona fans hooked. If you plan on retiring your 3DS anytime soon, there is no better way to send it off than with Persona Q2.
Thanks for the liking, subscribing, and the sharing!